Good afternoon. My name is Peter Leithart. I am the president of the Theopolis Institute, and I'm delighted today here to be hosting a conversation with Dr. Steve Jeffrey, Reverend Steve Jeffrey. Steve has been our main Theopolis contact in the United Kingdom for the last several years. We've done conferences and events at his church, Emmanuel Church in Southgate in the north part of London. So he's been a great friend introducing Theopolis to many people in the UK, many pastors and other leaders in the UK, and being a great encouragement to us. Steve is in the middle of a move from London to Fort Worth, Texas, where he has taken a call to, is it Christ Church, Fort Worth, Christ Covenant Church?
It's All Saints, Fort Worth.
All Saints, sorry, All Saints. I should know that. Yeah, that's also a church where we've held a course. I'm sorry. Yeah, All Saints Church in Fort Worth, Texas, and he and his family are moving as soon as they're able, and he'll take up that call at that church. Steve has a unique perspective on the current events, the pandemic. Because Steve not only has the training to be a theologian and a pastor, but prior to that, he had another life where he did a PhD in physics at the University of Oxford and has done research and continued to have an interest in questions of science. And so Steve and I have been emailing back and forth over the last couple of months as the pandemic unfolded, as I've been trying to make sense of what's going on with my very meager understanding of statistics and scientific methods. And Steve has been hugely helpful. I trust it'll be helpful to those of you who are listening to this today. So Steve, thanks for joining me for this discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time.
It's a pleasure to be here, Peter.
I know you are some distance from your PhD work, but I think it might be of interest to our listeners to know something about the research you did when you were working as a scientist, and a little bit about that project. I know that it's fresh because I've heard you talk about it before. You can still talk at some length about it.
Yeah, that's the danger. I could talk all afternoon. So I built an instrument called an atomic force microscope. And these instruments are designed to enable scientists to study the surfaces of solid materials and also liquid-solid interfaces with extremely high resolution, like submolecular resolution. They've been on the market for a while before I started my work, but I built one that was 10 or 100 times more sensitive than anything else that was commercially available. And we used a device called a Fabry-Perot interferometer, which is a kind of fiber optic based laser system that enabled us to measure movements and displacements that are a fraction of an angstrom. An angstrom is 1/10 billionth of a meter. And so we could measure some pretty tiny movements and some pretty tiny forces. And we used the device to study solid liquid interfaces. Turns out that when you have a liquid at a solid interface, the liquid molecules arrange themselves in a kind of semi-ordered kind of structure, which is somewhere between a liquid and a solid. It's a kind of mushy layer. And we investigated the mechanical properties of those thin layers. We made some measurements in water, which got some biochemist friends extremely excited. We were the first people to do that. And because basically the human body is a huge bag of water. Every interaction between any part of the body and any other part is mediated through water across length scales of a few tens or hundreds of angstroms. And so protein interactions and cell membrane interactions and interactions between drugs and the receptor sites that they attach to, those are all mediated through these water films. And we were able to measure the mechanical forces and interactions at a very small scale there. We did a bunch of other things with it. So it's quite a cool little toy. So that was my work. And the group was just amazing. I mean, we had an outstanding professor who's now quite a senior scientific advisor to the UK government. I had the privilege of working under some postdocs who just were extremely competent scientists. And so I learned a lot from them. They're very careful scientists as well. So I remember Peter Hoffman was one of my postdocs, the guy, immediate kind of line manager, and unbelievably careful in all the measurements he took and all the inferences he drew from them. So it was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. But after that, I considered a scientific career, but switched paths in a somewhat unexpected direction, and here I am.
So at some points during that summary, I was sure you were making words up.
No, they're all true words.
Yeah, no, it sounded like something that from
it's not sci-fi.
Back to the Future. Something like Back to the Future.
Yeah.
Remind me how long you've been at Emmanuel.
Emmanuel began. We started on March the 1st, 2009, and you're right. I've taken a call to serve at All Saints Presbyterian in Fort Worth alongside Pastor Jeff Neal, who has been there for a number of years. Tremendously looking forward to serving alongside Jeff. Been getting to know the congregation a little bit. By God's grace, we've found a fantastic successor to me here, Steve Hayhow, who has been an elder at Emmanuel since the beginning of our life as a church and has previous pastoral experience. And so that transition this end has gone really well. God has been very, very kind. We're going to miss people here terribly, but we're excited about what's ahead. And once this craziness dies down, Lord willing, we'll be able to get visas and then head over to slightly more humid and warm part of the world than damp England. We have no problem with humidity today, actually, just warmth. And then we're looking forward to getting stuck in at All Saints.
Yeah. And prior to Emmanuel, you served in the Church of England for a short time, or for
that's right.
years.
Yeah, so I was immediately after seminary, I was an assistant minister for a couple of years in an Anglican church, and then before seminary, I worked for 3 years at a small Anglican church plant, which quite quickly became a number of larger Anglican church plants. And so there's a bit of Anglicanism in my blood as well, for good or ill. And that was wonderful, actually, because I'm a lot of my kind of convictions about ministry were formed in that context before seminary, and I've still got a lot of very good friends who I kind of grew up with and grew into the calling that we feel we have in those years. That was 99, 2000 to 2003. So it feels a long time ago now.
Well, one of the things we've been discussing over the last couple of months, emailing about, has been my effort to make some sense of the statistical, the wave after wave of statistical analysis that everyone is grappling with now. And most of us, myself included, have very little capacity to handle that kind of information and to assess what's going on, who's telling the truth, where are these numbers coming from, are these valid arguments with the data that's being discovered with the pandemic. And you have some important cautions about how we go about thinking about that kind of data and what's actually going on in statistical analysis.
Yeah. I mean, there are a couple of areas that I think it would be helpful for us to talk about, and a couple of statistical phenomena are one side of the coin, and then more broadly, there are some they're best described as behavioral or psychological phenomena. It turns out basically that the human mind is really, really good at certain kinds of intuitive judgments, but really, really bad at others. It's good at things like, if you look at another person's face, you can tell in a fraction of a second if they're angry or displeased or anxious about something, especially if you know them well. Your intuitive judgment of that is extremely accurate and very fast, and you can't even tell how you've done it, but you just do it. Same with somebody throws a baseball or a football or a cricket ball or something at you. Unless you're terrible at sport, you'll probably got a good chance of catching it, which it turns out is really hard to program a computer to do. Human beings are amazingly good at doing those sorts of things, but we're extremely bad at some statistical judgments. We lack an intuitive grasp of certain statistical realities. And then we have certain psychological biases which incline us to certain kinds of biases and misjudgments and misunderstandings. And one of the sad consequences of those is that we spend a huge amount of time arguing in the church about things that we shouldn't be arguing about, because really we don't know as much about them as we think we do. We certainly don't know enough to argue about them. We should normally only argue about things if we have good reason to think we're right. But most of the time, some of the arguments I have in mind are founded on extremely slim data or just complete misunderstandings. And my hope is that if we can identify some of these statistical or psychological weaknesses and biases, we may be able to at least be more aware of when we're slipping up. And
would you say that Christians have a particular difficulty with grasping making the kind of statistical mistakes, for example, or is it just people in general just have a hard time? There's no intuitive way to grasp some of these numbers.
No, it's people in general. It's not that Christians are worse than anybody else. It's just that we know better. But the problem in Christian circles is that we tend to paint these conclusions that we draw in quite sharply ideological or theological colours, so that our particular view becomes a test of orthodoxy. And what that ends up, that has all kinds of negative effects. Not least, it isolates us, it creates factions within the church communities that we're a part of. And this COVID-19 thing has been just a happy hunting ground, unhappy hunting ground, I think, for that kind of thing. There are one or two other areas, actually, and as we get into them, I'll try and start with some slightly less controversial things, which just to give a flavour of what we're talking about, and then draw some implications and applications to the slightly more controversial things that are on the agenda at the moment, that are occupying our minds. So.
Yeah. So why don't you start with one of the less controversial examples?
Okay. Well, I mean, if I can just start with a couple of caveats. So the first thing is, please trust me. I'm not trying to push, and I want to reassure people who are watching. I'm not trying to push a particular agenda on any of the issues that we're discussing. What I am trying to do is to alert us to when we might be thinking something right or wrong, but for bad reasons. Please don't infer anything about what I think on an issue just because I criticize some arguments whereby people reach a certain conclusion. And even when the issues are controversial, I'm really arguing that I don't think they should be so controversial, at least that there shouldn't be so much heat in what we're talking about. And the final thing, just by way of introduction, and then let's get into the examples. The weird thing is, almost everything that I want to talk about is really quite well known if you just know where to look. There was a great book written by a Nobel Prize winning economist, Daniel Kahneman, called Thinking Fast and Slow. And if the only result of this little podcast, video thing, whatever you guys call it, is that a whole bunch more people read that book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, that will be job done as far as I'm concerned, because he's just very, very good. I mean, every single subsection of that book is rich with insights, which really the only original thing I'm trying to do here is to show how some of those, a tiny, tiny proportion of them, can be applied to issues in the church. And there's far, far more in there than I'm going to be able to talk about today. So yeah, that's worth, if that's helpful to people, I hope it will be. So, so you want to kick off with some examples then?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay, let me start with a really uncontroversial one, but, and it's nothing to do with COVID-19, so you can all relax, okay?
Or maybe not.
Let me tell you a story, okay, and this is completely true. So, and what I want you to do is to think about this and then try and explain it. In the evangelical church in the UK, church growth in evangelical and reformed churches averages about 1% per year. But that growth is not evenly spread. It's concentrated in small churches, with a few exceptions. Larger churches are not growing as fast as smaller churches. There are some stories, in fact, if you get a large church, which in Britain would be 300 people, and it'll plant a church of 50, and the new church of 50 grows really, really fast, while the larger church, which is now 250, really struggles. And that difference is pronounced especially in urban areas like London, areas with lots of university-educated professional people, areas where there are lots of young people in their 20s and 30s. So those are just statistical facts. And I have a friend who did a bunch of research just trying to figure out the landscape. And that isn't up for debate. Okay? That's just what's happening. Now, here's the question. Why? Why is that difference between large churches, small churches happening? And as you can imagine, the church growth literature is filled with all kinds of explanations that purport to give the reasons for this. So, for example, people will say that small churches have more of a focus on evangelism, perhaps because they're more desperate. They're terrified of dying if they don't grow, or they're more flexible, or they're more energetic, or they have fewer rigid structures, whereas larger churches lack all those advantages. Others will say, no, people prefer smaller churches. People come to Christ because they feel that they're lacking relationally, and so they want a church where they can get to know people, and so they're not pulled into big churches as much as small churches. Others will say, no, it's easier to bring friends to smaller churches because it's less intimidating. And young professionals will say, well, we particularly prefer small churches because we're able to get involved more quickly. We feel like we've got a lot to give, and often they're gifted people, university graduates, energetic, not married, no kids. And so they want to give time to church, and so they'll find a smaller church they're more able to do that. And so all of these are the kinds of explanations, and if you Google the church planting literature, you find literally hundreds of articles seeking to explain why small churches grow faster. But what's actually happening is none of that, or almost certainly hardly any of that. What's actually happening is a very basic and widely understood statistical phenomenon called regression to the mean. And the way to understand this simply is if you imagine you've got a bunch of big churches and a bunch of small churches, and then a certain proportion of the people in those churches just move every year or so. On average, big churches will shrink and small churches will grow. If you've got a church of 100 and a church of 1,000 and 5% of the people move in a single year, the large church will lose 50 and gain 5, and the small church will lose 5 and gain 50. So there's no causal explanation needed at all to account for the differences in church growth. And actually that fits what's seen on the ground, because the excess growth that is enjoyed by the smaller churches is almost never evangelistic growth. It's actually what is sometimes called in the church planting literature transfer growth. It's Christians moving from other churches. And the exceptions to the rule, where the large churches that are still growing fast, are churches that are in big cities like London, and they're well known in university towns. So when Christian university graduates move to London, as tens of thousands do every year, they've all heard of St. Helens, Bishopsgate and All Souls Langham Place, and they tend to rock up there for church. In other words, what's happened is that a statistical phenomenon, which is not really very widely understood, even though it's quite simple, accounts for something which, because people don't understand the statistics very well, they instead create causal explanations of it. And you can have all kinds of fun. Daniel Kahneman's book is hilarious. He says you can start amusing conversations at dinner parties by asking questions like this. So why is it, for example, that studies show that women with a particularly high IQ are more likely to marry men with a lower IQ? And you can imagine the kinds of reasons people will give for that.
And we both have had that experience. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, my wife's had that experience. And people will reason along the lines that, intelligent men are intimidated by women who are as intelligent as they are, and therefore the women get left with less intelligent spouses like me and you, for example. And actually, the truth is very much more simple than that. It's just that the IQs of spouses are imperfectly correlated. So people at the extremes will tend to marry people who are more ordinary. There's no causal explanation beyond that that's needed. So what that illustrates is that the human mind has a very poor intuitive grasp of mean reversion. Or regression to the mean, sorry. Mean reversion is a little bit different. Regression to the mean. And that doesn't really cause any harm. But there are other things that do cause harm. And so on the subject of statistics, let's think now about what we're all thinking about, like COVID-19. You've got to tell me, in America, is there the same push towards testing that there is in the UK? What's the deal with testing there at the moment?
It's quite varied, as you would expect from state to state, but there's still a pretty strong push for widespread testing. Yes.
Right. Okay. So let's try and think what's going to happen. And again, we'll start with a disease that's not in the news so much, but which is better understood. Imagine if somebody could develop a test for multiple sclerosis. Okay, there's currently no specific test for MS. Horrible disease. It'd be wonderful if you could find a test for it, because then you could test everybody, and then people who you thought would be likely to develop it, then you could maybe try and develop some kind of preventative treatment or something of that kind, right? So imagine if you tested everybody to find out whether or not they're going to develop MS. What would you learn? The answer is you would not learn who is going to get multiple sclerosis, even if you tested absolutely everybody, because you'd need two other pieces of information. The first, you have to know how accurate the test is. No test is 100% reliable. So let's imagine you could develop a test that's 90% reliable. So it gives the right answer 90% of the time. That would be pretty good, actually, as tests go. Some are better, quite a lot are worse than that. But then imagine if you tested positive. You have a child, maybe, you tested positive that they're going to develop this disease in the future. Well, what's the chance, you think, if there's a 90% accurate test and you test positive, that you've got the disease?
I mean, the natural thing is to say a 90% chance.
Right, of course. And everyone would instinctively say that. And the answer is no. Before you can work out the answer to that question, you also need to know a second piece of information. It's what's called the base rate. That is the background rate of how many other people have the illness. And it's important to understand why you need to know this. The base rate for MS is about 0.1%. About 1 person in 1,000 develops the disease. So now imagine if you tested everybody, and even if all the positives give you a positive result, which occasionally they won't, but let's assume that all the positive ones do, 10% of the results are going to be false positives, because this thing gives a wrong result 10% of the time. It gives false positives in 10% of cases where people don't have it. So every 1,000 people you test, if you test random groups of people, every 1,000 people you test, you get 1 true positive and 100 false positives. So if you test positive for this disease with a test that's 90% accurate, there's a 1% chance you've actually got it. It's actually, you need to be a bit more precise than that. You use a tool called Bayesian Analysis, it's a very widely understood tool in the statistical literature, but it's not an intuitively understood concept in the human mind. And it's one of the great problems with widespread testing for diseases. So now imagine if you could test everybody for COVID-19, what's going to happen? And the first thing that's going to happen, most likely, is you would get tens of millions of false positives. Because we've got a test here in the UK that was in the news a few weeks ago, and it's 85% accurate. And so you get all these false positives, and immediately you get a mixture of panic and wild over-optimism, because everyone thinks, oh, we've developed herd immunity. But then the second thing that's going to happen is that somebody's going to go on the TV, and there are 1 or 2 people doing this, I noticed in the States, who would start explaining, no, this is really complicated, because they try and explain this Bayesian statistical background. And then you discover that you don't know the base rate for the disease. That's the problem with C19. The thing you're trying to find out is the proportion of the population that's got it. That's what you need to know in order to work out what the chances are that a person has got the disease, even if they test positive. But it's even more pernicious than that, because with an infectious disease, the base rate is not even uniform. The base rate in one town could be really, really high because there could be a pocket of infection there, but the next door town or the next door state would have a much lower base rate. And so even if you could test everybody for this disease, you would not get an immediate, clear picture of what the situation is. And then this is where Christians and others would weigh in, normally online and normally in a more heated way than perhaps we should. You can imagine the understandable frustration that people would express when widespread testing has been done and the experts, some of whom are the target of a fair amount of cynicism and criticism already, start saying, well, hold on, these results don't give a full picture. People will start saying, as some have said already, you can't trust the science, you can't trust the politicians. You know, their own tests have said that we've got herd immunity and they're still enforcing this lockdown and so on. And all of that arises, in this case, from the fact that it turns out we have a very poor intuitive grasp of the significance of base rates.
So testing the population can still be beneficial because you're getting some information. You're just not getting the information that the layperson thinks you're getting.
Exactly. Now, what that means is, if you've ever had a test, maybe you've had a test for a cancer screening or something, and a certain proportion of cancer screening tests come back false positive, which is why competent clinicians will never, ever recommend, you've had a test, you've tested positive for, let's say, breast cancer, you should have a mastectomy. No, you've tested positive, therefore we should investigate further. So testing, widespread screening should be used to identify people who need further investigation. And if you know the base rate already, and if you can take a random sample, which is very, very difficult or impossible to do with the COVID situation, if you do know that, then you can get a probability distribution, a kind of weighted probability distribution telling you how likely it is that a certain proportion of the population has the disease. But it's not telling us what we think it's telling us. And that's not the fault of science. That's like blaming, you can't blame Isaac Newton for plane crashes just because they're caused by gravity. This is just how the world works. And it saddens me that I can kind of see this kind of argument coming already in the social media space, and it ought not to come probably in the form that it will.
So what would you say in general about our state of knowledge of COVID-19 at this point, given those complications of the statistical analysis?
Well, it looks like
what can we learn? What can we know from it, and more existentially, more existentially, how can we assess our own risk of being infected or being at serious risk?
It's very difficult.
Does this give us information to that degree at all?
It will help a little bit, but it's really, really, really difficult. So you could imagine widespread testing giving results that were then fed into computer models, which attempted to extract numbers for, let's say, the R0 figure that people keep talking about, the roughly the infectiousness, how many people a particular infected individual is likely to infect during the lifetime of the disease with them. And that would be really useful to know. But I think that's dependent on lots of other factors, like what kind of social distancing measures are in place, and how heavily populated a state is or a region is. So you would learn some things, and it would be valuable to have the information. But we have this additional problem, of course, that there's a wide degree of mistrust of authorities, some of it earned, and then a higher degree of polarization in our political life than ever before in living memory. If you read Lyukianov and Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, they present results which highlight the dramatic increasing degree of distrust that one side of the political spectrum in America feels towards the other. Roughly speaking, Democrats have always kind of trusted Democrats, and Republicans have almost always pretty much trusted and liked other Republicans. But the degree of mistrust across Democrats for Republicans and Republicans for Democrats has been in steady decline for the last 20 years. And so that means that we selectively exclude from our consciousness data that comes from sources that we perceive to be on the other side.
Yeah. That's verging into the psychological issues that we want to talk about.
Right.
Before we leave the statistics behind, again, how do we, or and maybe I can throw a theological angle on this. How do we think through risk assessment? Most of us are not in a position to make decisions on behalf of large political entities. How do pastors make risk assessments for churches? How do parents make risk assessments for families? How does the statistical knowledge that we've gained inform that, and how do you balance that with what we're promised in Scripture about the Lord's care and protection of us?
It's really, really, really difficult. So a couple of thoughts. Normally, the way that you make wise judgments of risk assessment is by trying to adopt some kind of reasonable historical perspective. Is it safe for your kids to play in the park and to go on the swings and to ride their bikes unaccompanied? And lots of parents today were kind of helicopter parenting, constantly looking after their kids. And actually, a bit of historical perspective shows that's not really necessary. Just chill out. But we don't have the historical perspective in relation to this disease. We don't know what it is, really. So that's the first issue. The second is, I think there's a good case to be made, especially for people in positions of public accountability, like pastors. There's a good case to be made for just do what the civil authorities say. And I'm not ruling out, nobody would rule out, in principle, the possibility that a state might become tyrannical to the point where civil disobedience is a necessity on a wide scale. Okay, so in theory, we all, Christian and non-Christian, believe that option exists. But I think if you realize the complexity of the situation, you're more likely to play it safe for longer. And I think that's a good thing to do. And in terms of trusting God's providence, I think, in one sense, this highlights more than ever before that we really are in the Lord's hands. If everything goes well from now on, tens of thousands more people will still die, and the disease will still be with us for some time. And in 2 or 3 years' time, somebody who's got some immune disorder or diabetes or obesity or any of the other kind of comorbidity factors could die of this disease in 3 years' time. And our lives have always been in the Lord's hands, and this highlights the sense in which they are. It calls to attention our frailty, and I think that doesn't imply anything about what we should do, but it does imply something about what we should think and how we should pray. And there are no easy answers to the "what should we do" question, I don't think.
And I'm assuming that your answer about the import of all this for political leaders is the same kind of caution that you're saying is err on the side of caution. That's what you're.
But that doesn't then mean and I should make this explicit, that doesn't then mean we endorse every proposal to stem the flow of the disease at whatever economic cost, because there's also a economic cost and a a cost in human lives of everything else. Somebody's going to publish a paper in a year or two's time, no doubt, about suicide rates in the Western world in 2020.
Yeah,
and Lord preserve us, it's going to be horrendous. Alcoholism, drug abuse, not to mention just the ruinous economic costs and the damage to people's lives. And so I'm not suggesting that we have that a civil ruler ought to be hyper cautious and close everything down for the rest of the decade. I am suggesting probably that we should have a great deal of sympathy for the great difficulty of the decisions that these men and women face. And that's quite apart from the fact that there will be political and ideological differences between us and some of our civil rulers and authorities as well. That's complicates it yet further.
Right. Well, you started to touch on some of the psychological issues that you wanted to bring up.
Well, let's start with another. So we're switching from the statistic thing. Let's start with another uncontroversial example, which is kind of fun and sort of amusing. I'll tell you about a study that was done among university students. The psychologists asked 2 questions of the university students, and it matters a great deal what exactly the questions were. The questions were, first, how happy are you these days? And they asked them to give a numerical score on some scale or other. And then, second question, how many dates have you had in the last month? How many times have you been out on a date? And so they got then 2 numbers from these students. And what the researchers then did was to correlate the results between the 2 numbers. What that means is they applied a mathematical algorithm to work out whether the high answer for the first question tended to be associated with a high answer to the second question or not. And you can attach a number to that. And 1 means perfect correlation, 0 means absolutely no correlation. And the result was that the answers to those 2 questions were completely uncorrelated. So it looks like when you ask somebody how happy they are, the number of dates they had in the last month doesn't come into it, because otherwise you'd expect some correlation between these 2 answers. Okay. Then, of course, what they did was the clever bit. They reversed the order of the questions. They first asked the students, how many dates have you had in the last month? And then they said, how happy are you these days? And the results were completely different. The correlation was about as high as you ever get in any psychological studies or tests of anything. And so you think, well, what's going on? What on earth is happening that means that the students give different answers to, presumably they give different answers to the how happy are you these days question, because the how many dates have you had is, that's just a number. You can't debate that. But how happy are you? They're giving different answers to that question depending on what you've just said to them. And so what's going on is a process that psychologists sometimes call substitution. What they mean is when we're faced with a really difficult question, we don't answer it. But we don't realize we don't answer it. What we do is we subconsciously, without realizing it, we substitute an easier question and we give the answer to that question instead. So what was happening in this survey was that it turns out that how happy are you these days is a really, really hard question to answer. Just think what you'd have to do in order to answer that question. You'd have to think about your psychological state over these days. You'd have to ask yourself, what do they mean by these days? It's certainly not just today, is it? It's not right now. It's over the last, few weeks or months. You'd have to think about all the things you've done and how happy you felt at all those different times. And that's extremely hard to do. People turns out, are really bad at remembering how they used to feel and feeling the intensity of how they used to feel.
That's fortunate.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's a real mercy that we get over psychological trauma so quickly. But so what people do is they instead substitute a much easier question. And the question is, how happy do you feel right now? And anybody can answer that question, like, how happy are you feeling right now? And if you've just been asked how many dates you've been on in the last month, and the answer was 0, and then you remember, actually, I haven't been on any dates in the last year, and then somebody says, how happy do you feel? The answer is probably, Whereas if you just, met a new young lady or young gentleman, and you've been, seeing each other every day, and it's like your whole life is like, wow, this is exciting, and you've been on 27 dates in the last month, and then somebody says, how happy do you feel? You can see how happy you feel. So here's what's going on. We substitute an easier question for a hard one without realizing that we're doing so. And that is all over the place in this COVID crisis. So imagine some questions you could ask yourself. How serious is this illness? How much? I mean, you asked some of these questions to me a minute ago, and I hesitated because I don't know. They were really difficult questions, and I was trying not to substitute some other question. How much of a risk does it pose to my family or my church? And here's where the crunch really comes. What kinds of measures should be put in place to deal with it, and who should they be put in place by? Like, these are unbelievably difficult questions. But it seems that the internet is full of people who know the answers. But they're most likely the statements that are being made are not reflecting answers to that very, very difficult set of questions. What's actually happening is that somebody's just lost his job, and half his friends just lost his job, and his son's business has just died. And when they're trying to think, how serious is this crisis, they think, well, not half as serious as the economic ruin being brought upon us by the attempts to prevent it. Or you've got somebody else who lives down the road who's just lost their father and left wife and 9 children without a father and a husband and a provider. And that family who known to me. And so if you say, how serious is this crisis? And you just heard that tragedy has hit one of your friends. You're not answering the question, how serious is this crisis? You're asking the question, how do I feel about that dear family? And it's unbelievably difficult to avoid that kind of substituting an easier question for a harder question. And if you want a depressing 5 minutes, just scroll through Facebook and you'll see quite strong emotional appeals, one direction or another, depending on what kind of friends you have on Facebook. And it's not obvious that they're dealing with the unbelievable complexities of the situation we're in, because nobody can do that, because nobody really knows, but they're dealing very much with how we feel about it right now. And it leads to misjudgments and misstatements and hardened positions one way or another without adequate evidential foundation.
And how much of that is the substitution is putting the question back into a comfortable zone? So you're faced with an epidemic, and you have a standard way of thinking about health and disease, and this new thing gets filtered through that. But that's because you already have that pre-existing, and it doesn't adjust to the new circumstance. But you just filter through that, or the lockdowns. It's just filtered through the pre-existing political assumptions.
Associative coherence is one of the things that you'll read if you pick up some of the psychological literature. So it's a set of different phenomena, but in a sense, we have a set of, let's say, political views, views about mainstream or alternative medicine, views about education and therefore the value of expertise. And those views inform either positively or negatively our response to an expert standing up on TV and telling us that you must close your business down and lose your livelihood. Somebody who feels somewhat skeptical, and I think, with some justification in some cases about any of the experts or the leaders or whatever, it's likely that skepticism is going to be what's driving the response rather than the evidence that they have concerning the disease that we're currently threatened by. Because nobody has that evidence concerning the disease we're currently threatened by. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm. And in that case, do you think that that's would you say in that realm that Christians have a particular difficulty assessing evidence that challenges their pre-existing conceptions, perhaps because their pre-existing conceptions have received appear to receive the imprimatur of God's word itself? Their opinions are formed by God's word, and then when something comes and disturbs that, it gets funneled into something that they think is that we think. I don't want to talk about them. I want to talk about us. That we think is a biblical way of thinking about things. So it gets naturally funneled into that in that direction.
Exactly. Yeah, we baptize our political opinions mostly. And here's the thing: I think we should, or rather, it's not that we should baptize our political opinions, but our political opinions should flow from our baptism. It's not the case that politics and healthcare and education and all those other things are somehow outside the realm of the scope of the gospel. Christ is Lord of everything. We all believe that. And therefore, it's right that we should seek to have our opinions of those things formed by reflection on the scriptures and by our faith in Christ. But it's just extremely difficult to do so comprehensively. And interestingly, Lukianoff and Haidt talk about this in the Coddling of the American Mind. The tendency to see things in very, very sharply in black and white, like good and evil. And there's a sense in which there is, life is a battle between good and evil, or Christ has defeated evil, but we're in the mopping up operation, depending on your eschatology. But that doesn't mean that every human being or every clinician or every special advisor to the government or every politician is either an angel or a demon. But it's much, much easier for us to treat them like that than it is to have the kind of nuanced recognition that, even somebody from the other side might occasionally do something that's right. It's very, and of course, back to your point about the church specifically, for us, there is a lot more at stake, or there should be a lot more at stake in our disagreements than in other contexts. If you're working with a guy in the office and he's pro-abortion and you're pro-life, well, some people have colleagues like that at work, and you can still work with them, and that's okay, and that's all right. But in the church, disagreements of that ilk, and obviously that's a good deal clearer than the kinds of issues we're talking about. But we are, well, it's going to be interesting in the next few days, this coming weekend. Churches all over the country, some churches will be going back to worship again. And not all their members will show up, because some will have a different view of the seriousness of this issue or be more worried about whatever. And it's going to be really interesting to see, and I hope it's not painful to watch, but it might be, how that difference of opinion is received within those congregations. Are we going to have a situation where the two sides harden into virus deniers and virus and putative government agents? Is it going to be the kind of oversimplified kind of polarization that we get in so much of the rest of life?
Denominational splits as a result.
I mean, because you've already got the same thing. We'll talk about vaccines a bit later. You've got the same thing. You've got pro-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers. That's a thing.
Sure.
in the church.
Yeah.
Well, Jesus died in order to overcome divisions like that. But here we go, creating them. And we're creating them. I say it again, we're creating them off the back of misjudgments and misunderstandings, which flow from systematic, chronic, psychological and statistical failings of the human mind. Like we don't have a good intuitive grasp of these issues, but we act as though we did.
Yeah.
So we're tearing our churches apart needlessly.
So you mentioned a couple of those psychological ticks, obstacles to clear thinking and charitable discussion. You have, and I know you have some other ones you wanted to bring up too.
Yeah. Oh, let's talk a couple more. So let's start with another story. This is easier and quicker. Who are more likely to have extramarital affairs, politicians or bus drivers? Okay, and I'm not going to make you answer the question. Okay, everybody thinks...
We had this discussion yesterday, so you know my answer. It's politicians.
Yeah, okay.
I'll say politicians.
Right, of course.
So you can pick me apart.
No, and it's important to be clear about this. These questions are not trick questions designed to show off how clever somebody is who's read a few books on psychology. No, that's not what's going on. What it reveals is, and we all think of politicians and actors and celebrities when we think of extramarital affairs, unless, of course, we have much, much closer contact to something like that. But the truth is, it is unbelievably hard to find out the rate of extramarital affairs anywhere in a population at large, never mind breaking it down by profession, because it's not the sort of thing that people tend to talk about. I mean, how would you ever be sure, not even Ashley Madison can tell you, how could you ever be sure of identifying rightly the rates of extramarital affairs in different professions? It's a ludicrous idea. So what happens when you're asked a question like that is a form of substitution, but it's a particular kind of substitution. What actually happens is, instead of saying, what's the answer to that very difficult statistical question, we ask, can I think of any examples of politicians who've had affairs? And can I think of any examples of bus drivers? And as soon as you ask the question like that, a long list of politicians comes to mind. Because it turns out that if bus drivers have affairs, it doesn't tend to make it onto CNN. Whereas if politicians do, it does. Now, so this particular bias is called by some researchers the availability bias. That is, we respond to difficult questions by thinking of what stories or background narratives are available to us, what come to mind when we think of a particular topic. We don't respond at all to statistical data, especially not when statistical data is hard to come by. And we certainly don't respond to it. No, sorry, it's not that we don't respond to it at all. We don't respond to it anything like as acutely and keenly as we do to narratives. Another example, you remember in 2015, there was a photo of that poor turtle that had a straw stuck up its nostrils. Remember that?
I don't know if I ever saw it. I remember the discussion that ensued. Yes.
Right. So, and remember what happened was that there was this, painful scenario, and there's a video that went viral, no pun intended, of a vet, I guess, removing the drinking straw from the nostril of this poor little creature. Now, within months, you've got worldwide campaigns, major companies and governments talking about banning plastic drinking straws. Why? Well, because availability bias. When people are asked about what sorts of pollution are a bad thing, and people are always asking about what kinds of pollution are a bad thing, they think of drinking straws, which cause something like 0.03% of all plastic waste, or something. Some tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of waste that gets to the oceans is actually drinking straws. But it doesn't matter, because there is available to us all this tragic story of one poor little turtle that got one stuck up its nose. And then legislators respond, because legislators are just like us, and also legislators want us to vote for them. So they respond to the things that we respond to. And so broadly, this highlights actually this highlights a problem with the mainstream media. In order for a story to get into the media, it has to be extraordinary. It has to be unusual. Nobody is going to report family of 5 living in North London that not got COVID-19. It's not newsworthy, because newsworthy equals extraordinary, which means that the only things that make it into the news, at least at the level of individual narratives, are unrepresentative narratives. If they were representatives, they wouldn't make it into the news, but they are unrepresentative, therefore they're regarded as extraordinary and interesting. So think about what this is going to do to the COVID-19 situation. Back to these questions. Is COVID-19 dangerous to young people? Well, what do the statistics say? The statistics say that it's got a very, very low case fatality rate, as far as we can tell, with young people who've been diagnosed with it, treated for it. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of young people, tragically, who die. But it's way below 1%. But then what happens is there's this really sad story in the news just at the beginning of April. A perfectly healthy 13-year-old young lad died in London. He had no pre-existing health conditions. His family weren't allowed to be with him as he died. Absolute tragedy. So what comes to mind then? I overheard a conversation about the dangers of COVID-19 to young people. And it went, well, the statistics say that young people don't really suffer severe symptoms. But then the comeback was, oh yeah, but there is a risk. And what's being adduced subconsciously is this extremely compelling narrative that is, by its very nature, unrepresentative. And so it's not a good basis for making decisions about risk assessment and danger and so on.
Right. And so the relentless coverage of COVID-19, both by mainstream media and alternative media. I mean, everybody's talking about nothing but COVID-19 right now, and frequently talking about the as you said, tragic deaths that have resulted. So that even if the statistical issues were smoothed out, we still have this other bias that's built into that situation because of the coverage.
Yeah, exactly, because of the coverage. And so something, yeah, exactly right. And so let me, I mentioned earlier, I was going to mention something about measles vaccination. So I should say something about this, and let me preface it with just a caution. I'm not trying to make light of any of these things. I think that's probably obvious, but and I know that this is somewhat controversial, but I think it's worth saying anyway, because I think it might help us to see the kinds of misunderstandings that we're capable of making, and some of the reasons for them. So there is fairly widespread suspicion in some church communities and some other communities about vaccines. In the UK, the so-called MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella combined vaccine. I don't know whether it's the same one that's applied in the US, but there is huge, like overwhelming, statistically based, clinical, peer-reviewed, evidence-based support for the effectiveness of vaccines in reducing illness and death among especially young people. There aren't many things that are better grounded statistically than the effectiveness of vaccines. So why is it that there's widespread suspicion about vaccines in some communities? And the answer is partly, there's a bunch of reasons, but I think partly it's availability bias. There was a report back in the late 90s, Andrew Wakefield, a British doctor, who suggested a link between measles and autism. And probably everybody who's...
The vaccine.
Sorry, my apologies. Yeah, the measles vaccine. Yeah, quite right. My apologies. The measles vaccine and autism. And probably everybody who's watching this right now knows of somebody who had a measles vaccine and then developed autism. I do. I know of 2 kids.
Mm-hmm.
So when somebody asks me about measles vaccines and autism, what comes into my mind? Well, it's those 2 young people who are struggling with this, deeply debilitating mental health issue. Well, it's just quite a difficult situation to address because for those families and those children, it's really, really painful and difficult situation. We wouldn't wish it on anybody. It might be that there's a link. We don't know. There's not evidence for it, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There is some anecdotal evidence that Dr. Wakefield's speculations about the influence of digestive, the involvement of digestive issues and gut bacteria and so on. There's some evidence, but it's anecdotal really, of the connection to autism and the connection to the measles vaccine. But what there is a plentiful supply of is tragic anecdotal stories. And those anecdotal stories are the things that shape our opinions of these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's just, that's just how we operate. But it's not how we should operate, but it tends to be how we do. And I don't want to mention that the last thing I want to do is to upset people who've got a different view of that from me. I'm trying to avoid that. What I'm trying to suggest is, if you are watching this and you're one of the folks who've, for whatever reason, what is the reason? If you're skeptical about vaccines, try to ask yourself the question, why was it that you first began to become skeptical about the wisdom or the safety of using vaccines, or suspicious about their role in let's say measles vaccines, autism? Why? Was it because you had read hundreds of peer-reviewed clinical studies? Or was it because you had a friend who had a child who had and the reason why measles vaccines are given to young kids, and young kids develop autism about the same time. That's the reason, probably, why we've all heard these tragic stories of somebody had a measles vaccine, 6 months later they're diagnosed autistic, because it just happens at the same age.
Mm-hmm.
Now there might be a connection, but there's no good evidence to think there is a connection. Meanwhile, if you really want to harm the welfare of children across the world, stop vaccinating them. Like measles is unbelievably infectious. This R0 number that we've been talking about, the number of people that an infected person will infect. For COVID, it's somewhere between 0.7 and about 3, depending on the country and the circumstances. For measles, it's like 15 to 20 something. It's absolutely horrendous. Measles is off the scale infectious. So if we really, really need herd immunity from measles. Otherwise, somewhere between 0.1 and a few tens of % of kids are going to die from it, depending on the circumstance. The case fatality rate in measles is very hard to measure, it turns out. In the developed world, it's about 0.1%, 0. something %, but that's a lot of kids. A lot more than have died from COVID-19.
Right.
In some emergency situations in the developing world, it looks like CFR is higher for measles, a few % or even tens of %. It's shocking high. Now,
just you touched on this a little bit, but what is how do we go about? Well, first of all, it sounds like you're saying these are just kind of built into the way human beings engage with the world, whether because of created limitations or because of distortions of sin, however we want to explain it. These are just built into the way we engage with the world. So how do we, what can we do to mitigate the effects of something like availability bias?
Yeah. Probably not much. So, I mean, I'm absolutely serious about that. There's a couple of comments. Again, I want to refer to Kahneman's book. He's written the book, quote unquote, on this, not me. He says at one point, I'm generally not optimistic about the potential for personal control of biases. Now, so what that means is if we're serious about wanting to avoid the bad consequences of these kinds of misjudgments, we probably can't systematically avoid making the misjudgments. We might be able to reduce our propensity to them a little bit, but even statisticians are not good intuitive statisticians. That's another comment Kahneman makes. But what we can do is reduce the dogmatism with which we hold the views that we form on the basis of those judgments. So back to the measles and so on. The issue, I think, the issue is partly that there's a serious misunderstanding which could do harm. But the issue is also, because there aren't enough Christians who are skeptical of vaccines to make much of a difference, we're still not sufficiently numerous to influence society for good or ill. In the meantime, on that and on a whole range of other less ruinous issues, we are divided among ourselves and arguing among ourselves off the back of misunderstandings. Mm. And if we could just learn to say, I don't know, or be more tentative, or be less dogmatic, or be less intolerant towards people who disagree with us, if some of these issues became a bit less like a test of orthodoxy, that would be, I think, it's more likely that we'll be able to make progress that way than by systematically eliminating the biases. Mm-hmm. Because even the experts, there's a very revealing story in Kahneman's book when he talks about how he was a member of a group of people who was tasked with developing a curriculum for Israeli schools to study some of this stuff. And he began the project, and it went on a few years and was making some progress, but not much progress. And then they got to a certain point, and he asked, or somebody asked, has anybody ever done a curriculum design like this before? And somebody had. And then he said, so when you had the team of people doing that curriculum design, what percentage of them made it through to the end to actually get the curriculum written? And it was some shockingly low percentage, like a couple of tens, maybe 15%, 20%. And everyone was slightly stunned. And then I think it was Kahneman who said, okay, on average, would you say that they were better than us or worse than us or about the same? And he said, bit better, but not much. And Kahneman says, we should have stopped at that point. Mm. We should not have continued with a project that could have taken 4 or 5 more years and would still probably never have got finished, but we carried on. Mm. They're writing a curriculum on decision theory. They've asked all the right questions, which should make them stop the project, and they carry on anyway. Like, it's really, really difficult to eliminate these from the way we make decisions. Yeah. But what we can do, I think, is be a bit more gracious when we disagree with each other.
Yeah. You have a couple other things I know you wanted to highlight, a couple of these other psychological.
Let's talk maybe one more. Hindsight bias is headed our way in the next few months. Hindsight bias is the tendency to rewrite our view of what happened in the past in order to justify the claims that we remember making about it. You remember the Simpsons episode with the Bear Patrol?
I don't remember that one, and I'm ashamed. I watched the Simpsons quite a lot.
So the Bear Patrol van drives past, and Homer says, not a bear in sight. That Bear Patrol must be working like a charm. And Lisa, his daughter, is next to him, and she says, that's specious reasoning, Dad. By your logic, and she picks up a rock, she says, by your logic, I could claim that this rock keeps tigers away. And Homer says, oh? How does that work? And she says, it doesn't work. It's just a stupid rock, but I don't see any tigers, do you? And there's this pause, and then Homer produces a wad of cash and says, Lisa, I want to buy that rock. Right, now, you can see what that illustrates. That illustrates the tendency to rewrite the narrative of the past in order to justify the claims that other people can remember us making. We tell these causal stories to account for what we see and in order to prove ourselves right, whatever the outcome is. And we're really, really bad at reconstructing what we actually thought, and we're even worse at apologizing for it and repenting and retracting what we got wrong. So with this COVID-19 thing, what's going to happen? Okay, let's imagine that the infection rates end up lower than the terrible initial models predicted. I mean, the horrible forecasts from the original models. I don't know how good or bad the original models were. Governments will tell a causal story that gives them the credit for keeping the numbers down. See, kept the tigers away. And if the infection rates and fatality rates are really high, then the government will say, see, we needed those lockdowns because otherwise it would have been so much worse. Meanwhile, people who are skeptical of government intervention on these matters will be tempted to make exactly the same mistake. So if the numbers are really high, they'll say, look, the lockdowns didn't work. We just trashed our economy as well for nothing. And if the numbers are really low, they'll say, look, lockdowns are unnecessary. The models are wrong. The numbers were being revised downward the whole time. You've ruined our economy for no conceivable good reason.
Yeah. And then you might have some politicians who will choose the side that they were on in the past, depending on the outcome. Some might say, well, yes, we went through these lockdowns that destroyed the economy, but I was really opposed to them from the beginning.
Yeah. And I wasn't allowed to speak my mind because,
Yeah, politicians that will remain unnamed, but I think there might be politicians who would be willing to do that.
Yeah, and you can all think of public policy issues. I can think of a few in this country where we were assured, for example, I won't go into the details. We were given, Christians were given all kinds of assurance about not being forced to become involved in various ways with revisions to marriage law. It's okay, it won't affect anybody who doesn't want to be affected. Well, so much, that lasted a couple of years before the first person lost his job because he conscientiously objected to same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, we even with all the media coverage that we have, or perhaps because of all the media coverage we are very, very bad at holding ourselves to account properly. And our leaders are pretty bad at allowing themselves to be held to account. And so what's going to happen probably over the next few months is that the people who think the lockdown shouldn't have been put in place will tell the causal story, whatever the numbers are, to justify those claims. And they might be right. So here's the thing. It might be the case that the lockdowns were unnecessary. And who knows? News just in from Sweden. The World Health Organization is now holding up Sweden as a model for how to do things without lockdowns. I mean, is that right? I mean, I haven't read the original report yet. I just glanced at the news this afternoon.
Yeah. So, and if we could try to kind of wind this up, I think one of your concerns throughout, I know, has been the way the Christians have responded to each other when they have differed on as the pandemic was accelerating. Christians differing from one another about what was going on, how serious it was, how the church would respond, and all these biases and flaws that you've identified are operative. And what your maybe the lesson, the moral of the story that you want to draw is not just humility, charity, kindness, willingness to correct yourself and admit you were wrong. Those are right, but you're given a set of standards for self-evaluation or evaluation of how we've conducted ourselves. So it's a more specific and granular kind of standard to hold ourselves to, that identify ways that we haven't been humble, that we haven't been charitable.
Yeah.
Is that a way of summarizing what you've been?
No, that's definitely true. And the other thing, of course, is that we know far, far less about what's happening in the world around us, and even in our own minds, than we think we do. And you wouldn't know that from the way that we sometimes talk to each other. So all of the things that we've been talking about today, this is not these. Please don't construe these as I'm claiming that I know what's happening in our minds. No, I'm claiming that these are some ways in which we don't know what's happening. We know that we don't know, what's happening in our minds or what's happening in the world around us so accurately. And whenever we, this is maybe going back to being a scientist, whenever you know that you don't know something, you should say so. It's really bad to pretend that you know when you don't. So.
Well, thanks. That's a great way to end. Thanks for the exhortation. And Steve, thanks for the time. It's been great to talk through these things with you. And as always, I learn a great deal from you and enjoy our conversation. So God bless you and thank you.
Thank you. God bless. Bye.